Welcome back to One Road Research. I'm here with Roger Pielke. He's been doing a lot of interesting studies. And first off, Roger, maybe you can give a quick background about yourself, and then we can do a deep dive into some really interesting observations you've been making on climate change.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. I have worked at the intersection of science and politics for about 25 years. I originally thought I was going to go into the physical sciences, spent some time working for the House Science Committee in Washington, D.C., and discovered that the use and often the misuse of science is a pretty interesting topic to study and work on.
Great. There's so many things that we could touch on right now. I guess let's start off because our audience is capital markets focused. I see a lot of the analytics that you do referring to, for example, the impact of climate change or the lack of impact of climate change relative to GDP. How did you go upon thinking of it in that manner? Now, one thing that's interesting to state, though, is that, let's say from a global GDP perspective, I could argue that some countries obviously are trying to distort their GDP growth to some extent, like China. And when you look at the world over, there's a lot of intervention towards masking the GDP figure to some extent. So obviously in some countries that are so adamant on demonstrating growth, are we sure that we're using the right growth metrics, even though it's a highly accepted form of measurement?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's related both to the impacts of climate change, both looking backwards and looking forward, but also how we think about emissions reductions, which we could talk about. For me, I started working on this topic a long time ago in the 1990s when my mentor I was working for at the National Center for Atmospheric Research pointed out that the period 1991 through 1994 was the quietest period in a half century in the Atlantic for hurricanes, but it was also the most expensive due to Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Mm-hmm. And at the time, people were using economic losses as a proxy for understanding what weather and climate were doing. And that was clearly not a good idea, given that more than just extreme weather affects damages. It's where storms hit. It's how much concentrated wealth we have. It's the way we build. So we started doing some work, which I've continued for the last 2.5 decades, focused on trying to understand economic losses in this long-term picture, given that society changes. We call these normalization studies, and the grossest way to do it with a big sledgehammer is to use GDP,
right,
which is the total economy. But there are multiple methods that use much finer grain data, such as building stock and tangible wealth in particular locations. And these studies are pretty consistent across the board in showing that, at least to date, the primary factor that drives the increasing losses has been, it's good news. We're wealthier, we have more stuff, and this is expanding around the world. It's not necessarily, so far, more or more intense extreme weather events.
In one observation that I thought about while you were just explaining this is, I know that you do have other studies as it pertains to like landfall and the impact of hurricanes on landfall. And I guess one thing that I would note is coastal line GDP, I'd imagine, would be much higher relative to, say, for example, the Midwest. And but obviously, I guess you're taking in aggregate the whole GDP, but I'd imagine that coastline GDP for like cities and provinces and states would be representative more, would have a larger weighting towards the total GDP figure as well, which would be really interesting because obviously, like you're indicating, there's a lot of wealth there, but a lot of that wealth can also be distorted to some extent. For example, new home sales and then the prices of houses, because they are coastline, are just rapidly increasing. I wonder if there would be a way to measure it, like you indicated, by adjusting unnecessary asset price inflation, because that can lead to some distortion towards the decline of the impact that weather might have versus GDP.
Yeah, I mean, here's a statistic that's, when I learned it, I found it amazing that fully two-thirds of global catastrophe losses over the recent 3 decades are due to U.S. hurricanes. So obviously, extreme weather and disasters happen everywhere around the world. But if you look at the loss numbers, two-thirds of those numbers come from U.S. hurricanes. And the reason for that, once you think about it, is fairly obvious. The U.S. Gulf and Atlantic coasts are built up pretty much from Texas to Maine
Right.
with enormously valuable coastal property that when it does get hit, we see these multi-billion, multi-10 billion, even $100 billion loss events.
Mm,
That said, we're seeing around the world similar patterns of growth in coastal locations, which are obviously desirable, for personal reasons, but also for commerce reasons. So yeah, the coastal regions are outweighed in terms of their contribution to GDP, but also to their contribution to losses that we experience due to catastrophes.
right. And I'm assuming that the United States must make up a large percentage of even global GDP if one was to assess this from world GDP perspective as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, I've also heard, I saw one of your testimonies, I guess in front of the Senate, was that?
Yes.
Yeah. And I did hear someone bring up interesting point. They had said like, are you measuring when you're talking about landfall, like, why is that the metrics? I guess you were saying that this is a counter to the economic impact, but then I saw this lady point out the fact that the frequency of hurricanes from a sheer number count throughout planet Earth has actually increased. Do you know anything about this, and is that a fair interpretation of what's going on?
Yeah, we've actually researched this in some depth, and it's also been summarized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Just had its most recent report come out about 3 weeks ago. And there's two ways to look at it. So if you're in insurance or reinsurance, what you really care about are those storms that hit land and hit land where there's structures that are covered by insurance.
Okay.
We did a study, and we've updated it every year, on landfalls. So this is the number of tropical cyclones, hurricanes worldwide that hit land.
Okay.
We have good data all around the world since 1970. For some basins, like the United States, the Northwest Pacific, you can go back further in time. But since 1970, there is no up or down trend in the number of storms to hit land. And there's no trend in the number of the strongest storms to hit land. This is also consistent with other research that looks at the intensity, the frequency, what's called the energy in these storms since that time. And this has been,
is this
yeah,
taking
go
into
ahead.
account the most latest hurricanes that hit Florida as well, which was reported in the news to be relatively intense? Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I mean, and the recent storm Michael that hit Florida was exceptionally intense. The
Hmm.
final analysis will have to wait, but it was certainly a Category 4 storm. It's a tragic anytime a storm wipes out communities. But if you look at the bullseyes along the Gulf and Florida coast, you can say that in the big picture we dodged a bullet on that one, because it was an enormously powerful storm that hit a relatively low population area. The world has averaged over the past 30 years or so about 5 intense hurricanes per year to hit land. This year we're at 6 so far. We're getting near the end of the year, so it's not at all an unusual year. In fact, one of the more notable features of hurricanes is that from 2005 to 2017, the U.S. went without being hit by one of these intense hurricanes. So it's really important to take the long view on these issues, because 2016 and 2017 and into 2018 have seen some more intense storms, but that comes after a decade plus long period of not seeing those storms.
Right. And could you touch on floods, droughts, tornadoes, and wildfires as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in luck because the IPCC periodically does summaries of the state of the science on extreme weather events. And if you take a look, there is really good evidence that the world has experienced more and longer heat waves in particular. There's a sharp decrease in cold spells. That's where the best evidence is for changing extremes. There is some evidence, and it's pretty strong in some locations, that there has been what's called increasing precipitation, so more intense rainfall. But we have to be careful because more intense rainfall doesn't necessarily mean more floods. And in fact, the IPCC has concluded that it's not yet possible to detect an increase or a decrease in major flooding around the world. Same goes for drought. Same goes for tornadoes. Wildfires are a bit tricky because those are really mixed up with human settlements, where we build and ignition and so on. But there is some speculation, and I think it's safe to say speculation, that drying and heat waves are associated with greater wildfires. But that, again, is complicated by a human signal. I mean, the overall bottom line is that climate change is real, and scientists expect that we may see more extreme events coming in the future. But we don't want to confuse what's going on now with what's expected in the future. And I know it's politicized and this is, it's media friendly, but the state of the science right now is that, to date at least, there's not a particularly strong signal of human-caused climate change in disasters.
So when we look on the internet and we see all sorts of these interesting memes and even these video footages from the likes of National Geographic that are showing us eroding land masses due to, I guess, higher ocean levels. It looks quite extreme though, Roger, and how, like, based on all your statistics, it seems to counter the visuals that we're seeing. Mind you, maybe your statistics are more US-centric, but like, how do you, even as a scientist, you're looking at the empirical data, when you're seeing all of these images and they're showing you adjustments in like land, what do you think about that? Or is that due to human intervention by populating in those areas or trying to like create like artificial land masses as well? What is the explanation and causality for all of this fascinating video and satellite imagery?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I stated, climate change is real, and humans have a significant role in it. Sea level rise is real. Increasing temperatures are real. But at the same time, the same research that tells us about the reality of climate change also tells us that, while there are every year extreme weather events like floods, hurricanes, drought, we're not yet able to say that those events have increased due to accumulating greenhouse gases. So it's pretty straightforward. Of course, in the debate, people do like to point to the latest extreme event as evidence of climate change.
Right.
There is this thinking out there that if you tell people the latest hurricane was caused by climate change, they might want to support this or that political action. That the logic is not well supported. But I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, look, we have a global assessment process called the IPCC. It tells us that accumulating greenhouse gases are making the Earth warmer. We see more extreme heat waves, but we haven't seen more floods, drought, or hurricanes globally. Those things I don't think are at all inconsistent.
Now, in terms of, I guess this is one of the biggest debates in the community, right? Is the extent of contribution that, I guess, CO2 emissions through burning fossil fuels is having on climate change. Now, it depends, I guess, on your models and your sensitivity analysis. What is your perspective here?
Yeah, and again, I defer to the global assessment process that's been put in place since the late 1980s, which the consensus view of the scientific community is that the warming the globe has seen over the last half century or so is primarily, if not totally, due to the emission of greenhouse gases. There is a lot of interesting research out there on the effects of land use and, for example, irrigation, how we change land cover, urbanization, and so on. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the emission of greenhouse gases and primarily carbon dioxide, is a primary driver of changes we've observed in climate and we expect to see into the future. So I don't think there's a particularly strong scientific debate on these issues when it comes to policies like the Paris Agreement or so
Right.
on. The general understanding is that we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It's accumulating. It's caused some changes we've observed, and it may cause more, and we may not like them. So the science from that standpoint is pretty robust, and I wouldn't expect it to change anytime soon.
And what about global temperatures over like the history of the Earth? Does it not go in cycles, and are we not part of maybe a potential uptrend in this cycle?
Yeah, of course, there's a long history, but in terms of, I mean, that's interesting to my climatologist colleagues and so on. But from the standpoint of climate policy, extreme events, things that decision makers in the public and private sector care about, those debates and questions aren't particularly relevant to understanding how the climate might evolve over, the next half century and what steps might be done to reduce emissions.
Right. But I guess in terms of understanding the future impact that we could have on weather, it really depends on the variables and the extent of sensitivity in all the different models that we're looking at, right? Because I'm sure everyone has, I heard Russia has a different model relative to other institutions as well. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, when it comes to, I mean, I would point to extreme events. So these are the things that focus people's attention. As you say, there's a lot of imagery and they're wrapped up in the politics of the issue. There's a lot less certainty about how patterns of extreme events might evolve into the future than there is about the fact that things are getting warmer, they're expected to get warmer, and so on. So when it comes to dealing with extreme events, it's not possible to accurately anticipate how many droughts the world will have in the 2050s or how many hurricanes. And people tend to pick the scenario or model that they like best or best suits their need. From the standpoint of decision making, it's important to have resilience, to be robust, and realize that almost exclusively all of the things that we would expect to occur in the future under climate scenarios are things we expect to occur today. Perhaps there'll be more of them, perhaps they'll be more intense. But if you're in Miami, you're going to prepare for hurricanes, whether they go up by 15% or down by 15%. The city could be decimated by a Category 5 storm under any of these scenarios.
Right. So I was speaking to Dr. Patrick Michaels as well, and he kind of indicates that, because I questioned him, I said, okay, look, there's obviously a big academic community that's studying this constantly. And what sounds interesting, and I think you followed the events of like the likes of Climategate, is if your data is empirical and there's statistical significance behind your data sets, why is it that the scientific community, which is supposed to take good data and try to make good policy decisions, potentially kind of put this information in the back burner for some objective when, for example, I haven't spent that much time recently in academia, but I'd assume that if one is an undergrad or one is doing a postgrad and maybe doing a thesis on climate change, hypothetically, that individual, which potentially could go into a position like yours, conducting some of the kind of studies that you're doing in the future, would want to maintain some, I guess, integrity in terms of the studies that they're producing. Because it sounds like one of the ideas here is there's some big potential conspiracy theory that people are pushing an agenda, and now we know the reason why. But why would academia be so heavily involved in something like that? Particularly when, like, I study the ethics of science and the philosophy of science. Why would you not want to do that? And I think one of the key things is in capital markets, when we're building financial models and economic models, I'm not interested in in distorting the numbers, because if I'm distorting the numbers, then that means I'm not being right. And to me, being right is so important, I guess because I'm so economically incentivized to be correct in my assessment in the stock market, for example, or some investment or speculation. I have no biases because I have to be a pragmatist in finding, alpha opportunities and market inefficiencies. So why is it in a science or in art, whatever you want to call the assessment of climatology, why would people be so skewed, which is what, you hear about?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot there to unpack, but I mean, one thing I say to colleagues when talking about extreme weather events and damages and losses is, if you really want to get an accurate sense of how the market sees these issues, look at the trends in reinsurance pricing over
Okay.
recent years. And reinsurance has had a hard time, maintaining a hard market because there's more capital available than there has been payouts, because there hasn't been, from their standpoint, there hasn't been enough disasters.
Right.
But more generally, of course, scientists are people, and scientists have views, and the climate issue is pretty intense, and there's some hardball politics.
Right.
But that said, there's no conspiracy. There are mechanisms in place to try to summarize and bring forward the best evidence, data, and science that's available. And it's interesting because about a decade ago, when the IPCC would produce its assessment reports, it would often be criticized from people on the right side of
Yeah.
the political spectrum for being too, at the time they'd use the word alarmist. Interestingly, when the recent IPCC report came out about 3 weeks ago, it was mostly criticized by people on the political left for not being sufficiently scary.
Right.
So when science is summarized and put out there, of course, there are always going to be legitimate minority views. Science evolves. But I mean, for me, I think sometimes we overthink the climate issue. The reality is, no one argues that we're putting massive amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And if that process creates any risks whatsoever, that's, above zero, then we ought to be thinking about taking action. Add on to that the fact that climate is always variable and uncertain. We're building out infrastructure all over the world as people get wealthier,
Sure.
in exposed locations in a lot of places. So the idea of limiting or even working towards stopping the emission of greenhouse gases and better adapting to climate, to me is kind of a no-brainer. And a lot of the scientific arguments are a sideshow. They get wrapped up in the politics, but they're not going to change the fundamental core of the issue.
What's so interesting on that very statement is when I think about the oil industrial complex, I'm sure they contribute a significant portion also to global GDP. I guess your own recommendations, say for example, if we understand about people's contribution to climate change and we go with that, that's an undisputed fact. The issue though is imagine the impact on GDP if we try to introduce alternatives that might not yield the same kind of, I guess, economic impact. Because to date, according to how I understand, there is no substitute to the amount of energy you can produce through 1 barrel of oil. And so many things can be created off of a barrel of oil, especially once refined. It would be nice if solar could replace that, but just the amount of sheer energy that can be produced with the current technology that we have, it's just not economically feasible. And I guess the best thing that the oil industrial complex can do is explore opportunities like that of natural gas. And I'm assuming that what the right does when they look at your data is say, well, we still don't have clear indication about our impact on extreme weather, which what the left is saying is happening all the time, especially when you watch like the amazing news coverage. It looks like every day's the potential end of the world because of what we've done. And I think it sounds like you're kind of entangled in this fascinating web between two polarizing sides, but your data does say something. And then to me, what it sounds like that I kind of have to just like, I just kind of have to keep the status quo to some extent. I'm aware that this is happening. I don't know about the sheer causality that we're having on extreme weather, but then I know that there's no other great alternatives unless economic incentives are there. And the issue is that when the state is subsidizing green energy, they're doing so for a reason because it's not yielding the same amount of energy, and companies haven't found opportunities to generate, significant profitability in doing so. So I feel like we're kind of just like stuck based on all the information that we currently understand.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of where the issue is. If you look at rates of decarbonization of the global economy, so you look at how we're getting more efficient in how we use energy, and you look at the proportion of energy that comes from carbon intense sources, from fossil fuels. Right. Neither of those metrics have changed their historical trend based on climate policy.
Right.
So for all the sound and fury in the big picture, globally, there's not much evidence that we've changed from what we've always been doing.
Right.
A few years ago, I coined a term called the iron law of climate policy, which says that whatever we decide to do on climate policy, appreciably reducing or trying to halt GDP growth is going to be always going to be a non-starter.
Right.
And so the way that if we really want to decarbonize the global economy, the way we do that is through technological substitutions. We come up with sources of energy that provide either present or ideally better energy services. And if that happens, then a lot of the politics goes away, because there are vast parts of the world where there's not a lot of wealth and there's not a lot of access to energy. And dirty coal energy is better than no energy.
Right.
So the route toward dealing with this issue is through technological innovation, which we do pretty good.
You know what's so interesting is the inspiration for the technological innovation based on my experiences in free markets is actually high energy prices. So that's and we've seen that in terms of horizontal drilling and the new abilities of the United States to become a massive fossil fuel exporter. But I think that's the cue, and I've always looked at that. Like whenever I want to understand about the economy, I need to look at consumer spending, the signals. Whenever I want to understand about commodity prices, I need to, or the commodities overall, I need to look at the commodity price as an indication of interest and demand. We've seen that with cryptocurrencies. When Bitcoin is $17,000, people are heavily inspired to go into the space. Not everyone's going to make Bitcoins. People are going to make enhancements of cryptocurrencies or their own cryptocurrencies. I think the same thing applies for the energy space. Is like there's got to be the economic incentive for the private sector to come up with a solution. And as you've seen, every time the state seems to intervene into the space, the reality is it doesn't take away from the fact that we're just not able to yield the same amount of energy and generate the same amount of profitability for the alternatives, basically.
Yeah, there's a few things there. One is that for a long time, and I think there's still this view out there, the idea that the way to motivate an energy transition was to make dirty energy more expensive, and therefore favoring clean energy substitutes. Mm-hmm. It turns out that shocker, people don't want their energy to be made much more expensive. It's drag on the economy. So there's been, while people will pay, some cost for perceived environmental benefits, you're not going to be able to increase a gallon of gas by a factor of 2, for example, maybe not by 10%. So there has been a shift towards the other way around, to be thinking about, well, how do we make clean energy cheaper? And the example, the best example, and you pointed to it, is the technologies associated with fracking, the horizontal drilling, so on, which really, if you take a look at that history, it has some important lessons. That was not simply the product of a free market private enterprise coming up with new technologies. Starting in the 1970s, the U.S. government, the Department of Energy, worked with private sector companies to invest in technologies that at the time were not ready for market, were not profitable, and helped to get them to a point where through public-private partnerships, they became viable technologies 30 years later.
Interesting.
So there is an important role, and we've seen it, whether you look at the components of your iPhone or fracking, where public investments in innovation do bear fruit, but sometimes it takes many, many decades. So I and many of my colleagues have argued that the sooner we get focused on innovation, recognizing that there's an important role for the public sector and the private sector, and whether that innovation is carbon capture or it's advanced nuclear or battery storage or advanced solar, we don't know where technological breakthroughs will come through. But just like fracking, the minute that we discover a viable technology that makes energy cheaper, it expands throughout the marketplace. I mean, coal in the United States is going away, not because of environmental campaigns, but because of the simple economics of fracking that have made natural gas far more preferable.
Yeah. When I think about fracking, I'm thinking about mostly the 2000s, where it starts to become a little bit more mainstream and acceptable. And I'm thinking about the fact that a majority of these oil and gas companies were able to absorb a large amount of debt in order to utilize some of this technology due to the fact that you had $150 a barrel oil. What I mean by the $150 barrel of oil is that it inspires the oil industrial complex to look for alternatives, like you said, maybe cheaper forms. But what I mean is you also need a cue, an incentive, just like an indication that, wow, there is a value to energy. And in whatever iteration or form factor that I can create energy or find energy and extract energy, at least I know that there is going to be some nice economic incentive to do so. So for example, if you had like $150 barrel oil today, someone might say, okay, look, I'm going to really work my butt off and try to really innovate solar technology so that I can capture a piece of this action. Another important note on this is that for these new exploratory technologies, you need the balance sheets that are necessary to absorb this risk. So for example, what I mean by that is like, let's say 50% of ExxonMobil's financials might be segmented into like gas, and the other 50 in terms of their revenue could be segmented into oil. And I think that you need these kind of entities to be able to absorb potentially lower margins initially but be able to skew it to higher margins based on some legacy form of energy. And I see that that's the role and function that they're playing. By the way, I'm not saying that this is the greatest solution of all time. I'm just saying that this seems to be something that is a little bit more economically feasible to make these things possible.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. And again, I and my colleagues have argued for a long time that the role of implementing a carbon tax or a carbon fee is not to make energy so expensive that people notice the change in price,
Right.
but to acknowledge that really the global energy economy is enormous. It's tens of billions of dollars, and even a small carbon price can raise hundreds of billions of dollars, which might be turned around and invested in innovation in the energy space in partnership with energy, recognizing that global energy use is just going to continue to expand around the world. I mean, the other thing is if we don't have a floor price on fossil fuels, then even if we are successful in displacing them with renewables or nuclear or other technologies, there's still going to be massive supply. The price is going to go down, and it's going to be more difficult for the alternatives to go under that price. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we would want to focus on innovation, to think about not just R&D, but the whole process of innovation, the role of the private and public sectors. So I see that using today's energy economy as the basis for building a bridge to tomorrow's is something that really hasn't been the focus of climate policy so far. I
Right.
think it's missed
Yeah.
opportunity.
Well, this sounds so fascinating. I love how we kind of came up with some interesting angles and perspectives here near the end of this conversation. And I look forward to being able to keep in dialogue with you and just kind of brainstorm this situation. It seems to be a very interesting intellectual puzzle, but also a very real issue that's amongst the stream of consciousness right now.
Yeah, if there's anything that the climate issue needs, it's more discussion, more debate, more opening up to new and different ideas, because obviously what's been tried so far hasn't made much of a dent, and we'll have to do things differently going forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Roger. I hope to stay in touch with you again.
Thank you.